A newborn baby cannot feed itself, cannot move itself, cannot regulate its own temperature, cannot survive a single hour without another person. By almost every biological measure, it is the most helpless creature that has ever existed on this planet. And yet, within minutes of being born, it turns its head toward a voice it recognizes. It roots toward warmth. It flinches at pain. It cries when something is wrong. Something is happening inside that skull. The question is, what exactly? And the deeper question, the one that scientists have been circling for decades, is whether any of it involves experience, whether there is something it is like to be a newborn. Whether, behind those eyes that cannot yet focus on a face, the lights are on. Let's start with what we used to think. For most of medical history, the answer was essentially nothing. Newborns were considered neurologically incomplete. Conscious experience, it was assumed, required a developed cortex, language, memory, a sense of self across time. Babies had none of those things. As recently as the 1980s, it was standard medical practice to perform surgery on newborns with minimal anesthesia. The assumption was that they could not process pain the way adults could. That assumption turned out to be wrong, badly wrong. We know now that the newborn brain is not empty. It is not a blank slate waiting to be written on. It is an extraordinarily active system already running processes that no one fully understands, already responding to the world in ways that go well beyond simple reflex. And the question of whether any of that activity constitutes awareness, whether a baby knows, in any meaningful sense, that it exists, turns out to be one of the hardest questions in all of science. Not because we lack data, because the question reaches into territory that our tools were never built to map. Here is what we know about the newborn brain. It is not undeveloped, it is differently developed. The subcortical structures, the brainstem, the thalamus, the limbic system, the regions that in adults generate arousal, emotion, motivation, and basic awareness, those are fully functional at birth. What is not yet complete is the cortex, the outer layer of the brain, the part we associate with language and reasoning and conscious thought. For most of the 20th century, scientists located consciousness in the cortex. The cortex is where the action is, the argument went, and babies don't have a mature cortex, so babies don't have consciousness. That argument has not held up. A landmark paper published in 2012, signed by some of the most respected neuroscientists alive, including Christoph Koch, who spent decades working with Francis Crick on the biology of consciousness, argued that the subcortical structures are sufficient for conscious experience, that you do not need a mature cortex to have awareness, that the deeper, older, evolutionarily ancient parts of the brain are capable of generating something that deserves to be called experience. If that is true, and the evidence increasingly suggests it is, then the newborn brain, with its fully functional subcortical system, may be generating something like experience from the very first minutes. The hard part is that we cannot ask, we cannot run the standard test for consciousness, which is essentially to ask the subject what is happening inside them and compare it to what we observe. A newborn cannot tell us anything. Neither can a sleeping adult or a dog or any animal that lacks language, and yet we don't assume those systems are dark. We infer experience from behavior, from physiology, from structural similarity to systems we already know produce experience. And when we apply those same tools to newborns, the picture becomes very difficult to dismiss. Newborns show pain responses that are not simple reflexes. They don't just withdraw from a painful stimulus the way a sea anemone contracts from a probe. They cry. Their heart rate and cortisol levels spike. They show facial expressions that in adults we read without hesitation as suffering. And those responses persist. A baby that was in pain an hour ago is still more irritable now. Something is carrying forward, something that looks from the outside like the lingering trace of an experience rather than a processed signal that has already been cleared. Researchers at University College London showed that newborns as young as a few hours old can distinguish between stimuli applied to their own face and stimuli applied to a rubber surface nearby. They respond differently to their own body being touched than to an object being touched nearby. This is a rudimentary body map, a system that already knows the difference between self and not self. That distinction, knowing where you end and the world begins, is one of the most fundamental features of any conscious system we have ever identified, and it is present from the first hours of life. Then there is the question of what newborns remember. For a long time, the answer was considered to be essentially nothing. We don't have conscious memories from infancy. Most of us have no retrievable memories from before the age of 3 or 4. But the absence of retrievable memories is not the same as the absence of experience. You cannot recall most of what happened to you yesterday in any detail, but that does not mean yesterday wasn't experienced. The fact that infant memories don't persist into adulthood tells us something about how memory consolidation works in an immature brain. It tells us nothing definitive about whether experience was happening while it was happening. And there is some evidence that more is retained than we assumed. Newborns recognize their mother's voice from the first hours of life, a voice they heard through the walls of the womb for months. They show measurable preferences for stories their mothers read aloud during pregnancy. Something was being recorded in there. Something was being processed. Whatever word we choose for that, it does not sound like nothing. Here is where it gets stranger. Some researchers working on infant cognition argue that a newborn's experience, if it exists, might be more intense than an adult's, not less. The reasoning is this: adult consciousness is highly filtered. We have learned through years of experience to suppress most of the sensory information that floods our nervous systems. We walk into a room and we don't consciously register the temperature, the smell, the texture of the floor, the precise timbre of every sound, the exact quality of the light. We filter all of that automatically and attend only to what seems relevant. A newborn has no such filter. Every sensation is arriving raw, unmediated, uncompressed. The philosopher William James famously described the infant's experience as a blooming, buzzing confusion. He meant it as a description of chaos, but some researchers now think he was partly right for the wrong reasons. The infant may not be confused. It may be overwhelmed, flooded with input in a way that adults have learned to suppress and have mostly forgotten what it felt like. That possibility sits uncomfortably with the assumption that infants are somehow less conscious than adults. It suggests that the development of the mature brain is not simply the addition of more experience. It is in part the construction of walls against it. The question of whether a baby knows it is alive is not quite the right question, though. Knowing you are alive in the adult sense requires a concept of being alive. It requires the ability to hold that concept, to place it against an alternative, to understand what it would mean to not be alive. Newborns almost certainly do not have that. What they may have is something more immediate, something that precedes knowing in the conceptual sense, something closer to the raw fact of being. Philosophers have a term for this: phenomenal consciousness. The simple what it is like quality of an experience before it is named or categorized or understood. The redness of red before you know the word red. The heat of heat before you understand thermodynamics. If that is what a newborn has, then the question is not whether the baby knows it is alive. It is whether the baby is alive to being alive, whether there is something it is like to be it. And the evidence taken together makes it genuinely difficult to say no. The harder question is one we almost never ask. If the newborn is experiencing something, if there is something it is like to be born, What is that experience? What is it like to arrive? To go from the warm, muffled dark of the womb to the shock of cold air and light and sound. To take the first breath, which for a newborn is an act of enormous physical effort, the lungs expanding for the first time in a way that is one of the most violent things the human body ever does to itself. We know the newborn cries. We know the heart rate spikes. We know that the stress hormone systems fire hard in the minutes after birth. What we don't know is whether any of that is accompanied by experience in the way we mean when we use that word. Whether there is a subject inside the body that the arriving world is happening to, whether birth is experienced or simply undergone.